Well, good afternoon, Tom. We just finished a successful online immersive. And in that online immersive, we talked about various things. One of your particular parts of your program was exploring the larger consciousness system. And that sometimes includes going out to alternate realities, which you can perceive. All of these virtual realities are accessible in the database, as you say. And one thing stood out when you were doing that exercise in the immersive, and it's learn from everything. Learn from other cultures, learn from exploring everywhere these alternate realities. And I think it might be important to say that you need to develop your own metaphors. What you perceive, what you experience, others will experience differently. It will be especially for you. So all of this exploration is possible for everyone. But I am interested to know, and I'm sure your audience would be interested to know, that from your observations, can you give us examples of different ways to the same goals, alternate realities, your observations of consciousness in these alternate realities? What can you tell us about that?
Let's talk about the general topic of what in the popular culture is called going out of body or exploring the larger reality. And I'd like to define just what that is. What does it mean to go out of body, to do an UBI? That was a term I think that Bob Monroe coined, because before that it was called astral projection. The concept there was that you were projecting your awareness into the astral plane. And the astral plane was a part of theosophy that was a subtle world, not the physical world, and something akin to the spiritual world, I guess. It was called the astral. And there was a lot of emotion and other things there. So that's the history. Now that goes back into the late 1800s, back when theosophy was a big thing, centered pretty much, I think, in England, spread around the world, created what's now called Spiritism, which is now various places in the world kind of follow that, but it all came out of that middle to late 1800s resurgence in metaphysics, spirituality. Okay, now, so with the time Bob Monroe came along, astral projection had been studied by several people. There was half a dozen books that had been written on it, but they all came out of that same era. And Bob didn't want to connect it with anything. He didn't want to connect it with other metaphysical systems. He didn't want to connect it with the astral plane, any of that sort of thing, because that kind of begs a definition. So he just called it out of body. The problem with thinking of it as out of body is that you begin to believe that there's something in your body and it has to get outside of your body. That goes back probably 1,000 years or maybe 10,000 years to where people believed that they had a body and then they had a spirit that lived inside their body. And that the two were necessary to have a whole being. If you had just spirit without the spirit would perish. And if you had just a body without a spirit, the body would perish. And that's why people in the 1800s who went out of body had a silver cord. That was like the deep sea divers with their air hose. You needed that silver cord to connect the spirit and the physical body, otherwise they both would perish. And of course, this silver cord was would extend, would stretch to however long you needed it to be, and it fastened to you not in the back of your head like in the Matrix movie, but this cord fastened to you between your shoulder blades, someplace. And everybody that did astral projection in those days had a silver cord that they could see when they were out of, what we can now call out of body. So we kind of moved up one notch away from that sort of thing with Bob's UBI, out of body experience, but it still had the same basic concept that had been around for hundreds and hundreds of years, that the spirit lives in the body and the spirit somehow oozes out of your body. And because we associate consciousness, spirit, and whatever with the head, then typically it oozes up out of your head or just floats directly up out of the body, sometimes like that too. And people who studied it next, and around the same time Bob was working, there were some in South America, now have a big organization in Portugal that basically defined this spirit body as an etheric body. And it was made of subtle energy, whereas the physical world was made of energy. This spirit body or etheric body was made of subtle energy. That means from the physical, you can't really see it, hear it, smell it, or touch it, but it's there just the same. Sort of like dark energy and dark matter, it's sort of the same sort of thing. You can't really measure it in any way, but it's there just the same. And usually when you say that, you say, comma, trust me, it's there just the same. Well, in my model, you're not in your body. You're not a spirit that lives in your body. Your body is an avatar, eye candy, something computed by the computer so that you, the consciousness, can visually see, and by the sense data you get, not just visually, but through all the dimensions of the five senses, you can see what's going on in your reality. So you see it, hear it, smell it, taste it, feel it. And you get this data and you just interpret data to be that physical reality. So there is no physical reality. As the Buddha said, the physical reality is an illusion. I say the same thing, and the physical reality is a virtual reality. It's a stream of data that we, consciousness, get and interpret. So you already are consciousness. You already are non-physical. Consciousness is basically non-physical. And for those of you who think consciousness is somehow created by a brain, that's what's called the hard problem, because it's so hard to prove because it isn't true. That's what makes it so hard to prove. Been trying to prove that and make a link there for a century in neuroscience, and there is no link in sight. There's some wild hand-waving conjecture about nanotubules and other things, but they're no more than hand-waving and conjecture. And the deeper you dive into those, the less they look like they would ever solve the hard problem, because it's hard because it just doesn't work that way. All right, so first I'd like to define what is then out of body. It is not leaving your body. It's basically finding another data stream to connect to so that you interpret that data to be a different reality frame. So our reality in this virtual reality is a data stream that defines this physical universe for us in terms of five senses. You can get another data stream that derives some other virtual reality, not our physical universe virtual reality, but some other virtual reality. And that other virtual reality could be a different physical universe than ours, or it could be more like the dream reality. It just depends on how many degrees of freedom you have, how many rules, how many constraints do you have. In a reality like our physical universe, we have a lot of constraints, a lot of things that we can't do. And what are those constraints? They're physics, chemistry, biology, for the most part. Physics says no two things can occupy the same spot at the same time. Oh, that's a rule. It's a constraint. You see, within consciousness, that's not an issue because there is no space. It's not a 3D reality frame. Consciousness is non-physical. Consciousness is information. It's an information system, and information is non-physical. Okay, now you might think, oh, information's physical. Look, a book, that's information. No, the ink is physical. The paper is physical. The cover is physical, but that's not the information. That's just a way to transfer data. You can move data around by putting it in a book and moving the book around in this virtual reality we call the physical universe. The information is the content, the meaning, the significance of what's in the book. That's the information that's in the book, not the paper, not the ink. So what is the meaning and the significance? Well, how much does significance weigh? How much does meaning weigh? How much space does it take up? None. Doesn't weigh anything, doesn't take up space. Well, already it's failed Newton's requirements for a real thing. It doesn't exist in any particular space or place. It's consciousness. It's non-physical. All right, so you already are a non-physical being. You're an individuated unit of consciousness playing an avatar, just like you play an elf or play a Sims character. You're playing an avatar. Now, you could sit down and play The Sims, and at the same time, you could load up World of Warcraft at the same time, and you'd have Sims and World of Warcraft both playing. And let's say, just to make it simple to understand that, instead of picture in a picture, let's say you just have two computers. You own two computers, they're both online, they're both sitting on your desk, and one of them has World of Warcraft and the other one have The Sims. Is that possible? Could you do that? Well, of course you could. And you could look at The Sims and follow what's going on, and you could still let go of that mouse, go over and grab hold of the mouse that was World of Warcraft and make your elf run away or fight or do something. And actually, you got two arms and two hands. You could have a mouse in each hand, one controlling the elf and one controlling the Sim character. You see, you could do that. So it's not that hard for a consciousness to switch data streams. If I play a little bit in The Sims, okay, then I'm in the Sims world. And I set that down and I go over and grab the other mouse and I play a little bit with the World of Warcraft. Now I'm in that world. All I'm doing is switching back and forth between two different data streams. And that switches me back and forth between two different realities. Because the World of Warcraft reality isn't anything like the Sims reality, because each virtual reality has its own rule set. And there's rules in the Sims that don't really apply or mean anything to World of Warcraft and vice versa. So that's the way we are. So what is out of body? It's basically letting go of this data stream and starting working with another, accepting another data stream. That's all out of body is. So how do you let go of this data stream? It's simply you let go of all your sense data. This data stream describes the data you're receiving in your five senses, right? Sight, hearing, taste, smell, touch. You get data that defines all of those parameters, and that then defines your reality. Well, not exactly. You look at that data and your interpretation of that data defines your reality. It's your interpretation, and your interpretation, of course, comes with filters and biases and things that you've gained in growing up. Your fears, your beliefs, all those things color your interpretation. So that's where reality comes from for you. It's your interpretation of the data you get from a server. That server is a part of the larger conscious system. Larger conscious system is an information system. Okay, so that server can configure part of itself as a computer. I mean, the larger conscious system can configure part of itself as a server or a computer. It can configure part of itself as an individuated unit of consciousness, which is us. And it can also serve as the operating system, or the thing that's basically in charge, to make the rules and to plan the plans. So out of body is simply picking up another data stream, and you first have to learn, first step, let the old data stream go. That's all you have to do first. And then the second one is grab hold of another data stream. That puts you out of body. Now, why is it that people in the classical out of body float up out of their body, turn around, see themselves lying in a bed asleep, and then they decide to have an adventure and fly off through the ceiling or through the wall off, to go do whatever it is they want to go do. Well, that's because they have a belief that they are a spirit inside the body, or that their consciousness lives inside the body, and the body and the spirit are two different things, and one can slip out of the other. And because they believe they're in the body, well, then what would they see as soon as they get out of the body? Well, they'd see, the room that the body's in, because if they get out of the body, that's where they are, in the room where the body's in. So that's why that classical out of body occurs with people separating from their body. Bob Monroe said he rolled out of his body. And others climb up ropes and look for, out of body hand. They have all kinds of techniques to do this, but they all end up as that subtle energy, etheric body in their bedroom, looking back at themselves sleeping. Well, all of that is just totally unnecessary. That's just a belief they have that when you go out of body, you're going to end up outside your body, inside your bedroom, watching your body sleep. It's a belief, no more than that. And out of body is just letting go of one set of data, which in our case means letting go of all our sense data and picking up another thing. It has nothing to do with our body. It's an attribute of consciousness. We are individuated units of consciousness, and we can grab another data stream. We can parallel process two data streams. Just like you could learn to put a Sims mouse in one hand and a WoW or World of Warcraft mouse in the other hand. And with practice, you could actually get both hands. It wouldn't be easy at first. You'd be kind of clumsy at it because we tend to copy one hand to the other, but you could learn that both hands were independent and you could play both games with a lot of practice. Well, so can consciousness. Consciousness can parallel process, or it can do one or the other, or one and the other. So anyway, so we got this idea what out of body is and what out of body isn't. It's not rolling out of your body and looking at your body lying asleep. That's a belief, no more. Okay, so how do we let go of all the sense data? Well, we do that generally through meditation, because we have to quiet the mind and get the sensory data to quiet down, to pay no attention to it. And it's not that we have to let go of it completely 100%, but we have to stop processing it. When you stop processing it, it means you just don't pay any attention to it anymore. Now, many of us do that all sorts of ways. We do that when we read a really good book. When you read a really good book, you're not aware of what's going on around you. You're not even aware you're sitting in a house. Your mind is so captured by the story that you're just following along in that story. And the fact that you're sitting in a chair in a particular house in a particular city, with maybe people walking around in the background, you don't even know that. Your mind has let go and stopped processing the sense data because it's full of processing the data you're reading in the book. See? So letting go of sense data is something people do all the time. Sometimes when you're at work and you're really, have a challenging problem and you're really deep into that problem thinking about it, you lose touch with all your sense data. It's just you and that problem. And maybe your hand with a pencil and a piece of paper or a computer and typing, but basically your reality of what you don't think. What am I smelling? What am I tasting? What am I hearing? You don't think about any of that. All that's not processed. It's there. There's still things to hear. There's noises going on. There's smells going on. There's, even tastes going on. You always have a kind of taste of what's in your mouth, whether you've eaten anything or not. It kind of has taste with it, but you're not paying attention to any of it. That's what I mean by you stop processing the data. So when you do that in a meditation state, and the reason I say meditation is you can't do that if your mind is full of stray thoughts. If you're trying to let go of those things and suddenly you're thinking, oh, what am I going to have for dinner tonight? Oh, let's see, I got a meeting with the boss 3 days from now. I need to prepare for that. And oh, my favorite shirt and pants that I usually wear, they're both in the laundry and I'm going to have to wear something else. And your mind's just constantly just jabbering about all the things that are going on in your life, all the things you'd like to go on in your life in the future, and all the things that went in your life in the past. All of those things are just in there jabbering around. Particularly the things that annoy you or stress you are there. So we learn to meditate, to let go of all of that and have no thoughts. Just sit still and have no thoughts at all. Well, that gets you about 90% of the way. You have no thoughts and you let go of your sense data. Well, when that happens, you find yourself in what I call point consciousness. You're a point of awareness in a dark void. The only thing you're aware of is that you are. So it's the Descartes moment of I am. I can think. I can be aware that I am. So that's it. That's point consciousness. Now, if the phone were to ring or a car driving by your house was to blow its horn, you'd hear it, and it might grip your attention for a fraction of a second, and then you just let it go. You wouldn't process it. It would just be meaningless background noise. So it would be there. So if a fire alarm went off, you'd get that really short thing, and you say, "Oh, what's that? Fire alarm. Oh, I better pay attention to fire alarm. I need to stop meditating and go see about this fire alarm." But if it's just your environment, children playing outside, yelling and screaming, and cars and horns honking, and TV running in another room, all of that you can just let go to where you don't process it. And after you don't process it for a few seconds and your attention goes elsewhere, it just falls away. It disappears, just like your environment disappears when you read a really engaging book, one of those books that keeps you on the edge of your seat. So you get the point consciousness. And when you're at point consciousness, just a point of awareness floating in the void, you are out of body. You're no longer getting sense data. Out of body is defined as no longer processing sense data. If you're no longer processing sense data, that's your data stream. Your data stream from the server that serves up our physical, what we think is physical, our universe. When you stop getting that sense data, stop processing it, you're no longer in that reality. Now, all you have to do, that's step one, let go of the sense data. Step two is have to grab hold of another data stream. Now, initially, that can be challenging because you don't know of any other data stream. What other data stream? What do I grab hold of? Well, you work that out by chance. You work that out several ways. One is you ask the system, the server, send me another data stream, and it'll send you one. And once you've gotten that data stream, you can always go back because now you have an address. That data stream defines a reality. And all realities are virtual realities. The only thing that's fundamental is consciousness. Every reality that's experiential, means where you can have experience, is by definition a virtual reality. So you can go to different virtual realities, get different data streams that offer you different choices, different worlds, different reality frames in which you can interact. So that's, now we just got the basics of what is out of body. What does it mean? What are you actually doing? You're just getting to point consciousness. That's out of body, no longer processing sense data.
Tom, you've done a lot of exploration in alternate realities, alternate data streams. Can you tell us what your observations have taught you in a general way that would apply to anyone attempting to reach another alternate reality? Now, when we speak of alternate realities, it's the virtual realities that you've just mentioned. Mm-hmm. They're data streams. They are physical matter realities and non-physical matter realities. And they have a great diversity. A diversity is something that we have yet to learn here in this physical matter reality. But there's lessons in a lot of these other physical matter realities and non-physical matter realities that show us diversity. And that would indeed be of great learning experience. Can you tell me what types of things you've learned from your observations from exploring these virtual realities?
Okay, we'll talk a little bit about virtual realities and what they are. Now, virtual realities, as you mentioned, come in all different sorts. If you have a really tight rule set, like our physics, chemistry, and biology, that sets the rules of how things have to operate here. And consciousness then has to play an avatar that can only function within those rules. So you can't flap your arms and fly away because our rule set says that won't work. You couldn't flap your arms fast enough and your little hands out there don't move enough air to lift your weight up. You know, we're not made like that. Birds are made like that. They can do that, but people can't. And all it takes is a little knowledge of physics to understand why not, why people can't flap their arms and fly. So the physics is the rules that define the reality and of this virtual reality. Other virtual realities can have their own rule sets. Some have rule sets that aren't so tight, that define everything. Here, our physics, chemistry, and biology defines almost everything that happens. Anything we do that's physical can be described in those terms. You know, those are the rules that define what happens physically. And mathematics is the way the system calculates the consequences of those rules. Okay, so the rules themselves tend to be able to be expressed mathematically. That's the nature of science and virtual realities. Okay, so if we have a rule set that doesn't define all the constraints, or not so many constraints as we have here, then we have a virtual reality, let's say, that's more like the dream reality, where you can fly. You don't even have to flap your arms. All you have to do is want to fly, and off you go, and you can fly around in dreams, or you can teleport from one space to another while you're in a dream. That's not a problem in that reality because their rule set is much looser than the one we have in our physical universe. Also, there are other virtual realities that have tight rule sets like ours. They have a physics, a chemistry, and a biology. It's just different than ours. You know, their biology may have evolved quite differently than our biology. Their chemistry is going to be similar, perhaps. Their physics may be similar because those two things are very fundamentals to a physical type rule set, but the biology certainly can wander all over the place. It's got a lot of room for being very different. The physics does too, has some room for being different. The chemistry has more room for being different, and the biology has the most room for being different as far as making a virtual reality. And the reason for that is all of these constraints have to go together and work together to make a consistent would be the word, long-lived virtual reality. If you had things that the rules would dissolve themselves or blow up, or the virtual reality would just come to an end, like ours will eventually come to an end when all the suns blow up and there's nothing left in our whole physical universe but maybe hydrogen atoms and elementary particles. That's all that's left. So our universe will one day disintegrate because the suns will eventually radiate all their energy. The energy will run down. That's the second law of thermodynamics, that eventually everything decays. So you don't want that decay to be too quick, though. If it's too quick, you can't really evolve a fun virtual reality to play in if it's going to dissolve too fast. So all these rules have to balance each other just perfectly so that you can have something that lasts long enough to evolve something interesting and is self-consistent. So that's where the different virtual realities come from. Now, what about the experiences there? These virtual realities are populated by IUOCs, individuated units of consciousness, just like IUOCs inhabit this physical universe. Okay, that's us. You and I and all the other people and critters and bugs that are conscious, we inhabit this virtual reality and we get data streams. Well, there are similar kinds of IUOCs that are inhabiting those other virtual realities that are physical, say, that are near physical, or ones that are not near physical, more like dream realities. And it's the same sort of thing. All of us everywhere are doing the same thing. We're making choices that help us evolve or de-evolve the quality of our consciousness. Another way of saying that, we're making choices that help us move toward becoming love or becoming fear. Another way to say that is we're making choices that help us lower our entropy rather than raise our entropy. So these all mean the same sort of things. So when you are in this physical reality, you're making choices that help you evolve the quality of your consciousness. When you go into the dream reality, different reality. Dream reality is another reality frame. And now you still get to make choices there. And the choices you make in a dream reality are just like the choices you make here. You make choices, and by those choices, you evolve or de-evolve your quality of consciousness. You raise entropy or lower entropy because of your choices. So there is nothing more real than information. To say, oh, our virtual reality, that's the real reality, and the dream reality, that's some kind of fake. That's something we make up. No, we get a data stream that we call our physical universe reality, and we get a data stream that's from in our dream reality. We get both of those data streams and we interpret both of those data streams. Different rule sets, different things apply. That way we get to make different kinds of choices. There's choices that'll happen in a dream reality that just would be very improbable to happen, in a physical reality. And that creates the diversity that you're talking about. Now, our choices can span over all sorts of happenings rather than just be limited to the things that could happen inside of this, what we call our physical universe reality, because that's very constrained by our rule set. So we don't have the wild and zany choices here that we might have in a dream reality. So a dream reality is another place to learn. Now we'll talk a little bit about that. That kind of gives the basics, but let's talk a little bit about out of body, or what Bob called out of body, which is really just consciousness shifting data streams. And you do that simply with an intent to do that. That's how you do it. You have an intent to have this data stream, and then you just have an intent to let this one go and have that data stream. And when you let this one go, means you have to let go of all your sense data. Okay, most people do that. It takes them about 15 or 20 minutes to go through a process of letting go of their sense data. But with practice, you can do it in maybe 1/10 of a second. You can jump from one to another very quickly and back again. And it's just it is so simple. It's just a matter of having an intention to do so. But that's after you've had some decades of practice that it gets that way. Okay, so what is this out of body experience? It's not dream. It's not a dream. It's different than a dream. It's more like a lucid dream because your intent and your mind is wide awake, making choices. Your logical function, your intellect is along with you. That's why a lucid dream is lucid. Your intellect goes along for the trip. Otherwise, dreams are all out of your intuitive side. It's all being level. Being level is what you are in an ordinary night dream. In a lucid dream, your cognitive function, your intellect goes with you. So you're in charge. The dream doesn't just unfold on its own. You can direct it. Okay, the out of body is like that. You can direct it. The difference is that with a lucid dream, you lose consciousness first and then reawake in another reality frame. Basically, what you do is you realize that you're dreaming, and then your intellectual part takes charge and says, okay, I'm dreaming. So now I'm in the dream world. Let's go on an adventure. Whereas the out of body, you are awake and you relax, you let go of everything, and now you're out of body. You don't fall asleep first. It's a continuous, transition. You don't have that break of falling asleep, but they basically amount to the same thing. The different in the experiences that people have in each has more to do with their beliefs than it has to do with anything else. people who are lucid dreamers believe that they're now loose with their own intent in charge within the dream world. And then they can only experience those things that are part of the dream world. Well, that's really not true. An out-of-body person is just free. They're no longer stuck wherever they were. Of course, the old belief was in their body. So now they can do anything, go anywhere. They're not really limited to a dream world. So that's the main difference. So people who have these beliefs, the beliefs that go with the lucid dreaming tend to be more constrained and limited than the beliefs that go with the out-of-body. But other than that, there's really no difference. It's that you are aware and you have a data stream, and it's not the data stream that's this physical reality. So a good metaphor, a good way of thinking about an out-of-body is that it is a single player game. For the most part, it's a single player virtual reality game where you will get a data stream sent to you by the larger consciousness system that will give you opportunities to make choices, give you opportunities to experience things that you would never experience here. And by those choices, you get to accelerate, you get to improve your evolution, the evolution of your consciousness, your quality of consciousness. So it's just like if you were born in a particular place and you never get more than 25 miles away from that place. And often that was like that, where travel was meant on foot, meant walking, and 25 miles is a long way to walk. So people tended to live, grow up, and die within 20 miles or so where they lived. And if that was you, then your viewpoint, your perception of the world, okay, your attitudes would all be what we call provincial. That means small, stuck in a province. That's where provincial comes from. It's like you've never been out of that province. Whereas if you go out and travel widely, and not just travel, 50 miles away or 100 miles away, but travel to other countries, travel to other cultures, and not just pass through them, but actually live there, be a part of that culture, be a part of that people. And what it does is it broadens you. It makes your mindset much broader. It makes your perspective on life, what's important, what's not important, what's significant, what's not significant. All that changes when you get this bigger picture if you were well traveled. Well, in the old days, being well traveled usually meant you were pretty wealthy, because traveling is pretty long, pretty tedious, pretty difficult, and very expensive. It was only the few who could afford to be well traveled. But they did have a more, like I say, they had a bigger perspective on life and on things, as opposed to the provincial attitude of just only saw a few things done a few way, and all of your life is just that. So it's the same with this going out of body, with going to other reality frames. It's the same with your dreaming. It provides you another set of perspectives with another set of choices that are very different than the choices you have at home. All the choices you have within 20 miles of your house all tend to repeat themselves. There's not a lot of variation in it, but the choices you have when you're, say in Asia, are a lot different. There's all sorts of different things to do and not do. They have their own rules and their own constraints, but they're very different than yours. And now you can kind of see both ways of doing it and see what are the advantages of both, and why does one conflict with the other? Why does one thing is a really great thing to do in this culture and a terrible thing to do in another culture? And then you think about that and you say, well, really, it's probably not all that terrible anywhere. It's just we think it's terrible or we think it's great. And suddenly your picture is expanded and you're not so belief ridden, and you don't have just a tiny little view anymore. So that's where
Tom,
the out of body will take you. It takes you to other spaces and places where you get to experience things you'd never experience here.
yes, and as a physicist, of course, your experiences are very unique to your being your work, you're being a physicist and a consciousness explorer. So when you travel to these other realities, I imagine one of the things you were curious about was the laws of physics. Did you notice or observe anything that about another alternate reality's laws of physics that was interesting to you? Did you learn something from their laws of physics?
Well, I did notice that there were things that were different. Things didn't work quite the same way. But for the most part, things were more similar than they were different as far as the basic physics goes. Okay, because the basic physics is the set of rules that actually allows the virtual reality to evolve and not fly apart. Like the physics of our virtual reality, if you changed, there's like 4 or 5 constants that if you change just one of those constants in the 10th decimal place, the whole universe would never have evolved. It all would have collapsed. It would be unstable. So to get a stable universe that is stable long enough to allow life forms and more advanced life forms to evolve, there's just not a lot of ways to do that. There's a limited number of ways you can do that and still get a stable result. So the basic physics I've found tends to be pretty common to most places. Also, if you look at geometric dimensions, being a point is pointless. That's a joke. Being a line, I'm talking about point land, line land, and flat land, and then 3D from the book Flatland. Living in a line has lots of points in it. It's not pointless, but it is it's very limited. There's not a whole lot you can do. Being in flatland is likewise extremely limited in what you can do. Well, being in a 3D, that's the sweet spot. In 3D, you define a regular space, with 3 dimensions, and you create space just by defining a point and calling it an origin, and then defining 3 mutually, perpendicular vectors, X, Y, and Z is what we call them mostly in math. And once you've done that, that defines all space everywhere. Plus infinity to minus infinity in all directions is defined with just making a point and saying that's the origin, and here are the X, Y, and Z axis. You've defined all the possible space that there is. So space is created just by an equation. Okay, but that space is very practical for moving around, for doing things, for interacting. Now you can go to 4 space and 5 space, and mathematics will keep right on going, to 10 space and 12 space and 14 space, and mathematics can operate in higher spatial dimensions, but they're very convoluted and complex a place to interact. Okay, they're not nearly as straightforward and linear as it is here. Okay, so the interactions, though possible, are more difficult, not as good a schoolhouse. This 3D just is a really good schoolhouse. Everything is simple enough that we can move around and do things that make sense to us. They're not all that complex, and we're not as constrained as the flat land, and not as constrained as line land and point land. But once you go to 4 spatial dimensions, now not 3 spatial dimensions and time, which we call space-time, which is a 4-dimensional thing, but one of the dimensions is not spatial. One of the dimensions is time. That's different. But once you go past 3 spatial dimensions, it gets so complex in the interactions within that kind of a space that it's not a good schoolhouse anymore. It's too squirrely. So even from a different perspective, because the point is interactions. It's about IUOCs interacting with each other, and those interactions need to be straightforward. They don't need to be highly complex about how things interact. They need to be very straightforward. So the physics of interactions needs to be simple enough to work. For things to have a lot of complicated interactions means you don't need such a complicated space to interact in, right? Because very complex interactions in a very complex space gets complexity on top of complexity, and pretty soon it's a poor schoolhouse for these social systems called IUOCs, individuated units of consciousness, making up social systems and interacting. That's how, you know, these choices come about. They come about from the interaction of IUOCs, individuated units of consciousness.
So the common thread of evolution in any virtual reality, in any alternate reality, is the choices that we make, the quality of choices that we make, and the interaction with others. That is the real evolutionary device that moves us forward.
Yeah,
Is that right?
That's exactly it. That's the key. It's the interactions we make with others. Now, it can be a single player game. This out of body is a single player game. And you'll run into all sorts of characters in that single player game. Like most single player video games have lots of other players in them, but all the other players are NPCs, non-player characters. You're the only player. Okay, so you can have that. And basically most out of body is a single player game with NPCs. The system is serving the game. Okay, now you can have a multiplayer game like we have here on, you know, planet Earth in this physical universe of ours. It's a multiplayer game here. So there's lots of players who are playing avatars, and the avatars interact. And you can have an out of body that has multiple players in it. Dennis and I once went out on an out of body together, and there were 2 players then along playing in that game. So you can have multiple players, but most out of bodies are single player games running into all sorts of NPCs. Now, what's the thread that's common running through these experiences? You know, you just said, what's the value? Well, the value is you get to make choices, and that the choices span across a wide diversity. So it aids your ability to evolve the quality of your consciousness with the choices that you make. So that's kind of the value of it. But yet the choices now that you get are given to you in this single player game in order to help you grow up, help you make those choices, help you let go of your fear. So you might get scary things happening there. You may run into monsters or other things, but those are things that challenge you to let go of your fear. Sometimes the system gives them to you as fear tests, or sometimes it's just something you create. Most of the negative things, most of the scary stuff you find in these games are your own fears. Your own fears materialize for you to interact with them as like they're physical things. So now it's not just that thing that you can stuff under the rug. It's that monster, you know, with 2 heads, big fangs, and blood dripping off the fangs. That's what you have to deal with. So it ups the game from something your intellect can control by refusing it to something you can't control and you have to deal with it. So that's a good reality, say, for helping you get rid of fears. Or you may run into different forms of yourself, different vignettes where you play out in them. Often it is symbolic, it's metaphorical. Dreams tend to be metaphorical. The things you dream generally are not what's literally going on. Sometimes they are, but often they're metaphorical. They're symbolic. Well, much of these experiences are too. The system is trying to help you learn in all of these various reality frames, and it gives you the information you need to learn. So if what you want to do is understand the nature of reality itself, they will start giving you images and experiences and places that help you understand the nature of reality itself, you see? So it depends on what your intent is as what you actually are going to experience. And if your intent is just to wander around and watch things that are going on Earth to see what the people are doing over at the country club, you know, on the other side of town, Well, you can do that. It's sort of remote viewing via out of body. You can do that, but you'll do whatever your intent is. If your intent encompasses bigger picture, you'll get bigger picture things. So those of you who have read Bob Monroe's books, Journeys Out of Body, Far Journeys, and Ultimate Journey, you'll notice that Bob ran into beings and situations that helped him understand reality, realize who he was, how he was, and got a bigger picture. It helped Bob grow up. That's what he got. That's what the server gave to him. He took that data and he interpreted it. He had to interpret it in terms of his own filters, his own understanding, his own knowledge, his own experience, but also his own beliefs and his own fears, his own baggage, as well as his own brilliance. He had to interpret it in terms of all of that. And that's what he saw. That's what he reported, and that's what he wrote down. Now, Bob was a very good reporter, so he knew not to embellish what happened, not to try to add to it. That's a problem. So a good reporter who reports their out-of-body experiences has to learn the skills of just reporting their interpretation of the data and not trying to make more or less of it, not trying to make it make sense, or not try to make it fit into some theory or to some things, like the silver cord. That was something that was added to fit in with their own beliefs. Well, if you do that, then the stuff you find out there isn't really so much what's out there. It's such a reflection of your own beliefs that you can't separate the two. So Bob was better than that. He didn't see any silver cords. He was pretty good at just reporting his interpretation of the data without embellishing them with lots of beliefs and fears. And most of the work that was astral projection was greatly embellished with beliefs and fears, because I don't know, in those days they just seemed to deal in a lot more belief than we do now. That's progress. Progress goes, you offload more and more beliefs and you get bigger and bigger picture. You travel around, see more things, you get more sophisticated, and the beliefs you used to hold drop away. So that's Journeys Out of the Body for Bob Monroe, are what he experienced in his mostly single player games with entities and people and things that Bob saw that he interpreted in terms of his own beliefs. That's what you get. So you have to take that not literally. You have to realize that's an interpretation. And when you get data that is very familiar to you, well, you can interpret it pretty exactly. You have a lot of experience. But when you get data that is very unfamiliar to you, data that's kind of outside of your understanding, it's very difficult to interpret it exactly. You start putting more of your own stuff in there. So so you have to look at the out-of-body adventures that people write about and realize that don't take them literally, just like listening to somebody's dreams. Don't take them literally, but look at what does it mean? What's the significance of it? What's the big idea rolling around in it? What did the system give Bob in his single player games that was of value to him, and when he shares it in the book could be of value to you? And what do you just discount in there that just was a reflection of Bob's belief? Like the time he stuck a hand through a hole and got a big hook in it, or he got stopped by a wall and he couldn't get over it, around it, under it, through it, and he was trapped. Well, those were just two of his fears. He had fears about not getting back, and he had fears about the unknown that could get you. So that was the hook in the hand through the hole, and that was the wall that he couldn't get around. And of course, none of those things really damaged him or did any harm to him. He always woke up in his bed, and he was just fine. So those were his fears being manifested there. So that's really the nature of out of body. It can be what you need, interesting things to help you learn. And if you're at a position where you don't know much yet, then it's going to be very general stuff that you might not even notice there is a lesson. It's just getting you acclimated to the process and to the possibilities. And the more you work at it, the more specific and the more meaningful it gets. Because
That's a good point, Tom, because your books have been out, the trilogy, My Big Toe, has been out for 17 years now. And what you published in your book was something about a physical matter reality that was a very negative physical matter reality. This question came up at one of your sessions. You mentioned a very negative reality. Now, have you recently gone back to that reality and decided that the research that you have done has changed your perspective of what was going on in this reality? The reality was not working really well. You said there was some other underground movement of good that was happening there. And I was wondering if it was a peaceful movement, was it successful, and has there been a shift in this reality? Now, your own experiences and your own extensive research have led you to see glimpses of this reality evolving over that much time. So can you tell us anything about what you've noticed?
Yes, you're talking about, I went to a different virtual reality that has a tight rule set like ours, which means it was it seemed like a physical reality. It had all the same things. So it had biology and chemistry and physics of its own, and a clock of its own. Every virtual reality has its own clock that measures time. So that's another thing we can talk about. Time is unique to each reality frame. But in any case, yes, it was a place that had de-evolved, had been better, had evolved more than it was when I saw it, then had de-evolved and basically sunk down to only one law, and that is what I think sometimes people call the law of the jungle. In other words, might makes right. Anything you can get away with is fair game. So it turned out to be a very horrible place to be, a very difficult reality to grow up in. It made our physical reality, our universe, seem like a happy little kindergarten school, for a bunch of almost enlightened people compared to this reality. It was so full of so much negativity, so much fear. I mean, the fear was just dripping everywhere. So that was the experience you're talking about. Yeah, and that was a long time ago that I went there, and I hadn't, up until you just asked me this question, gone back and visited. I still haven't gone back and visited in depth or detail, but while you were asking the question, I did go back and was visiting it while you were asking the question. So that gave me about a minute worth of time to go back and see how it was. But now that's just a glimpse. You don't get, it's like you can glimpse something for a minute and get a sense of it, but it's not the same as doing an in-depth study of it. I went there before multiple times and stayed as long as I could, which wasn't very long, because if you don't know the ropes and you're not really there and part of their culture, it's really hard to stay alive long enough to come to an opinion. It was that rough and mean a place that it was hard to stay there, to be embodied there for more than a short period of time. So I had to keep going back and going back and going back to learn about it. But when I just looked into it now, while you were talking, I went back, visited. Like I say, if you have an address of anything, you can go there instantly. And you can parallel process. So I was listening to you and parallel processing that. And it was different, which surprised me, because I thought it would have been about the same. When you're that degenerate, when your quality of consciousness is that low, it's really hard getting started again. It's really hard starting to become more and more positive. It's very difficult to become positive in a situation that is that terrible, you see. So it gets to be stable at that bottom. It's like you hit a minima. You know, in mathematics, you have equations and topography, and you have maxima, which things can't get any bigger than that, you know, any higher than that, and minima, things can't get any lower than that in your functions. And when you hit one of these minimums, which means minimum amount of quality of consciousness, it's hard to recover from that. So I would have anticipated logically that they would stay that way for a very, very long time. But what I saw wasn't so much a place that was a lot kinder and gentler, but I saw a place that wasn't so, what can we say, wasn't so frantic in its negativity. It's almost like there was a truce, almost like there was a, you know, not quite as vigorous a pursuit of self-centeredness and power. That's because, you know, it was a quick look. So I just wanted to get the feel of the place. So I kind of felt the energy around there and felt the place and kind of got some imagery by it. And it was calmer than it was. Now, whether this is a calm before the storm, I don't know. I'd have to go back. But it was a lot calmer than it was when I was there before. So that would tell me something's changed. But I'd have to spend more time there to know what that change
Sure.
really
That
really would
underground,
be.
sure, the underground movement towards good
Maybe is the result of
had an
this, or
effect.
maybe it's just a real good stalemate. You know, before it was everybody out for themselves, and there was lots of what we would call like warlord groups, and they're all struggling and fighting with each other. Perhaps it's just a stalemate. Maybe those settled down to just two big warlords. The other ones got destroyed or eaten, swallowed up by the two big ones, and now there's a stalemate. You know, I don't know. It may not be that the people who were on the positive side, which were very, very few, they were kind of the underground there, but there was some that were there. That may not be it at all. It may be a stalemate between two big negative forces, but you know, that may be a beginning. I hadn't thought about it before, but maybe that's how these things turn around. They get to a point of, you know, what did we call it? MAD, assured mutual destruction, to where, you know, it's going to hurt a whole lot no matter what anybody does on either side. So they start cooperating with each other and making treaties with each other. I mean, who knows? But I just saw this calm, and perhaps that's, you know, and the rest of it's now just kind of filling in for me as I'm talking. I'm kind of making things up to connect with what I saw. So it may have been nothing more than that. It may not be that the forces of good, you know, began to you know, take over or have more influence. It maybe just meant that that it finally degenerated to two massive powers, and those are stalemated. But that would cause
Yeah.
the calm. It's sort of like you know, the mafia. You had two big bosses of the mafia in New York, you know, and if it got, they'd be gang wars all the time, but they'd get to a point where that wasn't helping. Nobody was winning, and then they'd start making truces and cooperating and sharing. Okay, this is my territory and that's your territory, and they started dividing up the pie and cooperating rather than just fighting each other. You know, that happens too. And I never thought of it before, that's probably the way something that is that degenerate actually stops being degenerate. It probably is. It's a balance of power that tends to create a truce or a peace in which people can begin to be positive. They can, you know, they can begin to live, not with, you know, terror all around them all the time, if that truce holds long enough. So we'll
If they
see.
recognize that
Yeah.
to go forward, you've got to make some different choices. You have
So,
mentioned in some of your sessions that evil, they were talking about good and evil, eventually kind of implodes on itself. It doesn't work. And the fact that there was an underground that was working towards better choices might be
yeah.
hopeful. You have to go
Yeah.
back and check on that. We'll give you an update later on.
Yeah. Well, there were little pockets of those who did act nicely toward each other, who were moral, who did care. And there were little pockets of these, but they had to isolate themselves because you had this big chaotic free-for-all pretty much going on. And well, it wasn't entirely chaotic. You had forces, various forces of powers, but there was multiple of them. And what I saw was just, to me, was chaos. I suspected if I lived there long enough, I would have found some order in it, you know, but it looked to me to be very chaotic. And this time when I looked in, not so chaotic. That was the difference. Still looked pretty dark, still looked pretty nasty. And the potential for negativity was still there, but it wasn't nearly as chaotic. And that's something that you could get at a glance. You know, the energy just wasn't like this in a swirl, it was still. So
That's very interesting.
yeah, so it may not have, you know, that was your first guess. Oh, the forces of positive have grown, but not necessarily. It could be there's just a standoff. I never thought about how they might turn around until we just brought the subject up, but that's probably how those things turn around, is with some kind of balance of power that actually creates some peace. And in that peace, things start to develop. You know, people start saying, geez, it's nice that we're all not trying to kill each other for the last week. Isn't this pleasant? You know, maybe we should do more of this. And then it starts to grow from there. So maybe that place has started to move back in the positive direction again.
I hope you can check on that. So what it really comes down to, Tom, we're talking about these alternate realities, exploring the larger consciousness system. It's about using your own metaphors. Now, we have been talking about some advanced things that you had been spending decades on researching and noticing these different realities, but anyone can tap into these alternate realities and use them for learning and growing. And what it basically comes down to is learning, relationship, choice, improving quality of consciousness.
Yes, and those choices, the most meaningful choices, are interactions between conscious beings. And that's not just people to people, but people to dogs and cats and horses and, you know, bumblebees and all the, you know, it's how we react with our, you know, interact with our environment and how we interact with each other. It's our choices in this social system and in this ecosystem that we make that affect others. And those are the choices that have the power to evolve and de-evolve you. It's not, you know, there's millions of mundane choices we make. You know, do I scratch my head with this hand? Do I scratch my head with this hand? You know, or vice versa. There's millions of mundane choices we make that are neither here nor there. They don't carry any evolutionary power. But the choices that do are the choices of relationship and connection to other beings, other humans and other critters as well. And all of these connections between those that are conscious is in all the realities, that's the key element. It's true that anybody can get into any of these, but they need an address to go. Once you have the address, well, like you saw, I could just go off and do that because I had the address. But I've been now, you know, doing this sort of thing for 40 years. I've collected a lot of addresses. I've got a good fat little address book that has lots and lots of places and people and connections that I can go, you know, resurrect, that I can go do and look at. But that takes time. It's one step at a time. You have to just explore. And in the beginning, the system will just give you something because it's trying to help you understand. And as you understand more and more, then you're more likely to go from little vignettes that just you and some NPCs to go to places where there are other players. You know, like this ugly reality I just went to, you know, there's a lot of other players in there. It's not just NPCs playing that game. There's a lot of other players in there.
Well, Tom, there was also a good reality, one that was better than ours. And has that moved forward as well?
That's not as obvious for me to see. I went there just for a few seconds while you said that, but to see a change, I think I'd have to be there for a much longer time to actually notice a change. It seemed to be about the same, but when things are good, knowing when things are good and when things are better is a little more subtle than when knowing when something is actually as horrible as it could possibly be, you know, to a little better. That's a much easier thing to do. Yes, I've gone to some realities where they had evolved. They had, most of the people had gotten to the point that they were caring. And most of the people had fairly high quality of consciousness at those places. But that's rarer than the not too evolved cases are more typical. And our reality, our physical universe, is a really good mixture of both. We've got a very dynamic mixture of good potential and very positive ideas and views and connections, people caring, people with empathy, people with compassion, people who want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. We have a mixture of a lot of that with a lot of people who are very self-centered, you know, very much just users and what's in it for me kind of attitudes about life. So we've got a good mixture that creates wonderful opportunities for choices for growing up. So this virtual reality, I think, is probably one of the very best to be in if you're kind of in the middle someplace in your growth. You know, if you're kind of in the middle, you're not real highly evolved and you're not real, you know, lowly evolved or poorly evolved. You're somewhere in the middle struggling. This is a very good virtual reality to be in. So of those that I've been in, I think I prefer this one to the others as far as the growth challenges, and there's more action going on here. As you get into those that are populated by beings who are all grown up, there's less and less to do. There's less and less significance in the choices. You know, most everybody's making pretty good choices, so you don't get, you know, hit between the eyes with a 2x4, you know, by things that you need to change in your life so much. Most of that they've already gotten over. So it's a more subdued, very low entropy, but there's not nearly as much challenge there. So these particular people don't need a lot of challenge at that point. And there's not a lot of challenge at that point. But mostly they will probably begin to reincarnate into places like ours, or like the one now that if that's what's going on there is stalemated, maybe a lot of them will come in there. So that's really where they're needed. You know, places like that, just to sit around and congratulate each other on being grown up isn't very fulfilling. You know, that's boring. So they start to then fill in the other places, and that's what they do. So they come here, they go other places. They are teachers. And
Well, thank you.
sometimes they get those places and they begin to de-evolve. Sometimes they evolve more. You know, they're back in the mix again. So they're back getting a lot of challenges. It's not the same thing. So that's how it goes. The wheel keeps turning.
Well, thank you, Tom. We certainly have a lot of challenges these days, and it's a great opportunity to use them well. Thank you for all your wisdom today and
Well,
for doing this interview.
you're very welcome. A lot of people are interested in this thing called out of body. Terrible name, out of body, but a lot of people are interested in it. And I thought it would be a good idea to just discuss the fundamental basics. What is it? You know, how does it work? What are you really doing? And, you know, what is it like on the other end? What are these out of body experiences like? Well, Bob Monroe was interested in understanding the reality. So Bob Monroe got a lot of stuff that helped him understand reality, you see. So if you're interested in things that have to do with your growth, then the system will work with you and give you a lot of opportunities and a lot of lessons that are meaningful. If all you're doing is just hanging out and being cool and you know, seeing what you can see, then the system doesn't really give you much. You just kind of get stuff and you probably get bored and stop doing it because it just doesn't seem to turn out to be very interesting. Well, what you get depends on what your intention is and what you intend to do with it. If you intend to use it to grow up and to help, then you'll get more and it'll be richer and more fun. If it's just there as a lark or, you know, inquiring egos want to know or something like that, then it won't be much. And you'll say, yeah, there wasn't much with that. I got a few images here and there, but it never turned into anything very interesting. That's because your intent is not very interesting. Your intent is, from the system's viewpoint, is not that interesting to make it give you things that you're not really interested in. So
I think you set it out very nicely,
Yeah.
Tom, and it led right into the accessing the alternate realities. That was really well done, I think. Thank you.